1967 Six-Day War, hailed by many as the miracle in the desert. The Six-Day War of June 1967 forever reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. This defensive war on the part of Israel was the direct result of Arab violations of international law, hostile rhetoric, and terrorist attacks that led to a preemptive Israeli strike on June 5, 1967. The overwhelming Israeli victory led to the acquisition of Gaza and Sinai from Egypt, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The war solidified Israel's military superiority in the Middle East, as well as contributed to the development of U.S. and Israeli relations. However, despite these gains, Israel was met with Arab rejection and continued hostility as it pursued a peaceful settlement and recognition by its Arab neighbors. Background to the conflict: the Arab Front. The Arab defeat in the 1948 War of Independence and declining European colonialism led directly to the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in a military coup in Egypt in 1952. Nasser was known for his pan-Arab, nationalist, secular, and anti-colonialist rhetoric. In 1956, when Nasser sought to nationalize the Suez Canal, which had traditionally been operated by Great Britain and France, they sought to reassert their power through military means. They, along with Israel, attacked Egypt in October of 1956. The attack was condemned by the United States and the soldiers were forced to withdraw. The UN-negotiated ceasefire saw the introduction of a UN peacekeeping force in the Sinai and Gaza, known as UNAF. Despite this overall appearance of pan-Arabism and Arab unity under Nasser, there was heavy internal discord among the many Arab nations during the 1950s and early 1960s. The Syrian regime pushed Nasser to further confront the West and Israel, while the more moderate and pro-Western Hashemite King Hussein of Jordan sought a more conciliatory approach. In response to the pressure from Syria, Nasser stepped up his anti-Israel rhetoric by exploiting the Palestinian situation as a means of showing his strength in the Arab world. In 1964, Nasser called the first Arab summit to convene in Cairo. The summit led to the formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. The PLO began attacks on Israel, many originating from the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, which displayed King Hussein's weakness relative to Egypt and Syria. Israeli Front Israel, since its inception in 1948, was led by the Mapai, now known as Labour Party, which was largely rolled by Israel's founding father, David Ben-Gurion. However, during the late 50s and early 60s, rifts began to emerge that led to Ben-Gurion being ousted from leadership and sidelined as a political player. Ben-Gurion was succeeded as prime minister by Levi Eshkol. Eshkol's government provided a new and distinct way of conducting government. Whereas Ben-Gurion, aided by his colleagues Moshe Dayan and Shimon Peres, favored a military-first approach, Eshkol's government focused more on social and economic issues while encouraging closer cooperation with the United Nations and restraint against Arab aggression. Eshkol often came under fire from Ben-Gurion and his colleagues as being soft and not prepared for the defense of Israel. Consequently, for Eshkol, his focus on the economy and social issues began to backfire as the Israeli economy fell into recession and the Arabs began to sponsor more aggressive PLO terrorist attacks. In response to these pressures and threats, Eshkol ordered a retaliatory raid of the West Bank town of Samu on 13 November 1966. Role of the superpowers. The United States and Soviet Union took on greater role in the region following their victory in WW While the Middle East became yet another regional battle in the context of Cold War, it had added significance due to its vast energy resources. As with many of regions of the Third World, the decline of colonial powers Great Britain and France left a political and economic vacuum in which the US and USSR sought to fill. However, this proved difficult for the US because of its perceived similarities to the former colonial powers. Many emerging Third World states, such as Egypt's Nasser, saw the US as continuing the legacy of imperialism and exploitation. Naturally, many states gravitated towards the USSR, which advocated revolutionary socialist ideas that sought empowerment of oppressed victims of imperialism and capitalism. While both superpowers initially supported the creation of the State of Israel for widely different reasons, the USSR quickly changed its approach and favored closer ties with Israel's Arab enemies. The Soviets from 1956 onwards invested over $2 billion in military aid alone to its Arab allies. While the United States always maintained its support for the existence of Israel during the 1950s under President Eisenhower, It was not until the election of President Kennedy did the U.S. shift its policy more heavily in favor of Israel. Israel, along with Iran, became the two main pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the region to balance against Soviet and radical Arab threats. With closer ties forming with the United States, Israel, which had received most of its military aid from France previously, sought weapons from the United States to counter Soviet military weapons and aid going to Egypt and Syria. Escalation into war. On April 7th, Israeli jets shot down 6 Syrian fighters and mockingly buzzed over Damascus. It was the beginning of more cross-border attacks by Syria and its Palestinian terror groups, which further galvanized the Israeli government and people to take further action. These tensions were exacerbated as the Israeli Independence Day celebrations approached on May 14th. Thus, a Soviet message to Nasser informed him that Israeli forces had massed on the Syrian border. Although this message proved to be false, it nonetheless made Nasser mobilize his forces in the Sinai and called for the eviction of UNF troops from the region. The eviction of UNF sidelined the UN. The UN Secretary General in 1967 was seen as weak and indecisive. With the UNEF slowly being removed from the Sinai, Nasser's forces took up strategic positions such as the port of Sharm el-Sheikh, which overlooked the Straits of Tiran, which is a vital shipping lane to the east for Israel. Eventually, Nasser closed the straits. The closing of the Straits of Tiran was a de facto declaration of war on Israel by Egypt. However, Israeli PM Eshkol was reluctant to declare war until all diplomatic options were exhausted. Israel sought security guarantees from the world's powers, as well as support for their sovereignty and free passage of the international waters of the Straits of Tiran. Prime Minister Eshkol sent Foreign Minister Abba Eban on a multi-state tour in order to extract these guarantees and support. Eban got mixed messages from declining colonial powers France and Great Britain, who were reluctant to get involved in the Middle East. Eban then met with President Johnson in Washington, D.C. While Johnson was a strong supporter of Israel, he was constrained by his involvement in Vietnam and could never get Congress to consent to any support for military involvement in the Middle East if war broke out. Instead, Johnson offered a plan developed by the State Department and Pentagon called the Regatta and urged Israel for restraint and patience. The Regatta Plan was an international call by the United States to forcefully open up the Straits of Tiran. However, this plan failed to gain any traction among the European allies and the UN, with Egyptian troops massing along the borders in the Sinai and Gaza, as well as a new military alliance signed by Jordan that allowed Egypt to control its military as well as Arab rhetoric. At an all-time high, Israeli generals put tremendous pressure on Eshkol to give the orders for a strike. Moshe Dayan, who was recently appointed Minister of Defense, along with Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, devised a plan of taking the initiative, which was focused on destroying Egypt first, then turning to Syria and Jordan. The stage was now set on the Israeli side for a preemptive strike. The conflict. The war started early in the morning on 5 June 1967, with a massive surprise Israeli air attack targeting the Egyptian Air Force, which was largely grounded at several airfields in the Sinai, known as Operation Focus, Mokt. His attack involved nearly all of Israel's 200 aircraft and was a massive undertaking for such a small state. Despite Egypt anticipating an attack on any day, the entire Egyptian military, right up to its commanders Amer and Nasser, were caught completely off guard. Within a few hours, almost the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. While the ground campaign had yet to begin, the war in the Sinai was essentially decided already, as Egyptian soldiers had no air cover to defend themselves against any Israeli assault. Air power was crucial for the IDF, which had prided itself on establishing an elite air force with state-of-the-art aircraft and highly trained pilots. The IDF recognized the growing significance of air power in warfare and its experience in previous skirmishes against the Syrian Air Force in early April gave it the confidence that was needed to wage such a bold campaign. The ground campaign in the Sinai and Gaza went relatively quickly, as soon as the initial Egyptian lines were broken through. The Egyptian military command was highly unorganized and panicked once Israel had broken their lines and ordered a swift retreat out of the Sinai, thus allowing Israeli forces to easily cherry-pick retreating Egyptian forces while on their march to the Suez Canal. While Dayan's plan of attack focused on Egypt first, Israel also had to contend with Jordan to its east and Syria to its north. Eshkol and his cabinet pleaded with King Hussein to remain neutral in the conflict and to not get involved. However, his forces were under the control of Egypt and pursued aggressive tactics, which included shelling of Israeli forces. Jordan had a much smaller force than Egypt, but had better trained professional soldiers, especially in its Arab Legion unit, as well as American-made tanks and British fighter aircraft. However, they were still no match for the highly trained and well-equipped IDF. Thus, the IDF began an eastern push that included taking the West Bank and East Jerusalem from the Jordanian forces. The IDF encountered heavy Jordanian resistance in and around East Jerusalem as the United Nations Security Council pressed for a ceasefire on all hostilities. Thus, Israel hastily set forth to take East Jerusalem before any UN ceasefire could be secured by midday, June 17th. Now that the IDF had secured the main Israeli objective of taking East Jerusalem, which included the Old City of Jerusalem and the holy sites of all three major Abrahamic religions, Israel now declared its support for a ceasefire, but still pressed eastward all the way to the Jordan River. By June 8th, Egypt had accepted a ceasefire as Israeli forces had soundly defeated them. Syria, which had done the most to agitate war with Israel, took a rather cautious approach when news came that the war had begun. Syria first heard news that Egyptian forces had decisively beaten down the IDF and was soon on its way towards Tel Aviv. However, these reports were largely false and were propaganda put out by the Egyptian media. This became more apparent when the IAF, after destroying the Egyptian Air Force, turned its sights on the Syria Air Force. The IAF quickly destroyed most Syria warplanes. Syria, still taking a conservative approach, however, took up the higher ground in the Golan Heights and began shelling Israeli towns and cities in northern Israel. While the Israeli leadership was reluctant to confront Syria in Golan, Dayan took matters into his own hands and ordered the IDF to seize the Golan Heights and destroy the Syrian army there on June 10th. This was the final battle of the Six-Day War and was a swift Israeli victory. Analysis and aftermath. Israeli forces were a highly organized and efficient fighting force that had clear objectives and high morale, with a heavy emphasis on modern military tactics that included overwhelming air power and highly mobile army units. Israel's overwhelming victory brought it both international praise and condemnation. Most of the criticism came from the communist bloc states and Islamic nations, who also took part in violence against their Jewish minorities. The United States was Israel's biggest supporter. While helping Israel very little militarily, the U.S. took much pleasure in seeing a democracy destroy Soviet-aligned Middle Eastern states, with the conquered territories of the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Israel now found itself almost tripling in size and in control of 1.2 million Arabs. The Israeli cabinet met on 19 June 1967 to decide on the new territories. The cabinet voted on to exchange Sinai and the Golan Heights for peace treaties with Egypt and Syria, respectively. This became later known as Land for Peace. This decision was only passed by one vote in the cabinet. The issue of the West Bank and Gaza could not be resolved. Many ministers wanted to create an autonomous Palestinian entity there, but it was placed under military administration. The only issue that reached a solid consensus in the cabinet was over united Jerusalem. Like the 1948 war, many Palestinians fled their homes during the conflict that created a refugee problem in the neighboring Arab states. While Israel had little to do with the flight of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, it also did not do anything to prevent it or encourage the refugees to return. Israel insisted that the refugee problem would have to be solved within the framework of a comprehensive peace treaty. However, the Arabs soundly rejected this plan and insisted that all the refugees be repatriated and compensated without any conditions. Arab states. The total annihilation of the Arab armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria led to their complete humiliation. Nasser, who had promised the Arab world a new system of rule that would unite all Arabs and rid them of the shame that had been forced upon them by the imperialist powers of the West and Israel, proved to be a false promise. The war ended an era of domination of secular military regimes whose pan-Arab rhetoric called for uniting the Arab world. As a result, radical Islam took the place of secular pan-Arabism. This radical form of Islam was a combination of the fundamentalist Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia that inspired Al-Qaeda, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, which would later inspire terrorist organizations like Hamas. Immediately following the war, Arab leaders gathered in Khartoum, Sudan, and together formulated a policy that would exist among the Arab states until the 1973 war. In a joint declaration, the Arab states explicitly stated that there will be no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. This statement was followed by the UN Security Council Resolution number 242. In this document, the policy of land for peace was set forth. This principle stated that Israel must withdraw from territories acquired during the war, as well as securing the right of Israel to live within secure and defensible borders to be negotiated at a later date. In accepting this resolution, it was implicitly implied that you are now recognizing the State of Israel. Both Egypt and Jordan agreed to this resolution, with the more radical Syria and PLO rejecting it. Conclusion. The success of the Six-Day War has been heralded by many as a landmark event in which Israel freed herself from Arab encirclement. The decisive Israeli victory had emboldened Jews from around the world in celebration, especially in the wake of the Holocaust and centuries of Jewish persecution. This euphoria carried over to the Jews living in the United States who, after the 1967 war, became heavily involved in their support for Israel and support for a strong American-Israeli special relationship. The war not only excited Jews, but also many Christians, particularly in the United States, who celebrated the restoration of Jewish control over all of Jerusalem. While the Six-Day War became a celebrated event for many, it has also left a number of issues that are still lingering to this day, such as the disputed territories of Gaza and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and the creation of a Palestinian state within this context, as well as the Golan Heights issue with Syrian. However, had Israel not been forced to preemptively defend herself from Arab threats of destruction, many of these issues would not have developed. Overall, the war brought profound changes to a very complex and critical region and ensured the survival of the world's only Jewish state.